And this happened when all banks failed to make profits due to this collapse and banks ran out of money. So, in order to fix this problem, the United States government decided to create a central bank so that this would never happen again. And how does the federal bank exactly work? Well, the Federal Reserve has three tools at its disposal to achieve its objectives. First, it has the power to buy and sell bonds. This allows the Federal Reserve to alter the supply of money available in the nation's banks, and this will therefore change the amount of interest that banks charge people. When this fluctuates, the interest rates will also fluctuate. When the interest rates will also fluctuate. When the interest rates are higher, less people will be buying stuff, which means that the aggregate demand will lower. If more people are buying, or if the interest rates are lower, then the aggregate demand would go up, as more people would borrow money from banks and buy stuff. The Federal Reserve is the only organization that is legally allowed to issue money in the United States. Basically, it also controls the interest rates because of its exchanging of bonds with the US government. Let's talk briefly about the history of the Federal Reserve Bank. So, the Federal Reserve Bank started in 1913, and at the beginning of its history, the Federal Reserve Bank was made to give loans to banks that were struggling as a result of the Panic of 1907. Another important event in the Federal Reserve's history was the Amendment of 1917. Basically, what happened here is the government decided that more money needed to be printed to help with the war effort, but not too much that it would cause mass inflation. So from June to December of 1917, notes in circulation more than doubled. The war that was in question for this amendment was World War I. The Securities and Change Act that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed in 1934 is also a big part of the United States Federal Reserve history. It introduced new stricter rules to deter fraud and speculation in the stock market. Next, let's move on to what the US economy was like before the creation of the Federal Reserve. So basically, although the US economy was okay, there were many events that happened before the Federal Reserve that seemed to be issues. The first of these was during the Civil War. During the Civil War, the government printed way too much money, and this caused mass inflation in areas. This was really bad for the US economy and almost ruined the United States. Another thing that happened before the Federal Reserve was created in order to fix these kinds of issues was the Panic of 1907. Here, the banks almost ran out of all their money, so they could not give any money to consumers. These were big issues, so the Federal Reserve had to come into play to try to stop this from ever happening again, and that is why the Federal Reserve was created. Another question we'll ask is, what are some international comparisons of central banks that exist around the world? Well, there is the European Central Bank and the England Central Bank, as well as a central bank in China. These all serve very similar purposes to the US's Federal Reserve System. Is there controversy surrounding these countries' federal banks also? Yes, there definitely is. For example, whenever Chinese banks make any changes to their investment rates, there are always journalists and articles that criticize them or compliment them based on their decision. So now we'll look at the functions of the Federal Reserve. The first thing we'll look at is what the Federal Government Reserve's role is in exchange rates, interest rates, and money supply. So basically what the federal government does is it controls what the interest rates are, and they also supply money to the government and banks. Depending on what the economy is like for interest rates, they will increase or reduce these interest rates that banks can charge for their customers. This will increase or reduce the consumer spending. For exchange rates, because they're supplying money to the government, the exchange rates with other countries for their country's value, for their respective currency, will depend on how much money the federal government reserve gives out to the government and banks. Another thing we'll look at right now is, do other central banks have similar roles? And we'll look at the Chinese Federal Bank. So the Chinese central bank does have a similar function to the Federal Reserve in the fact that it can change interest rates. They are able to control the interest rates of banks across their country in order to better the economy. And this does come with a little bit of controversy, as it does in the United States also, because some people will or will not agree with these changes. Our next question will be, is the Federal Reserve Bank good or bad? So first let's talk about the bad with the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve can be compared to a simple anecdote. A town in the West has a bank which stores everybody's gold. When people deposit their gold in the banker will give them a receipt for their deposit. Over time, as more receipts are made, people just started exchanging receipts instead of drawing their gold for services and goods. As this became widespread across the town, the banker just made a bunch of receipts for himself and used it to buy stuff. And then when people came to get their gold, the banker didn't have enough gold, so he left the next day. This is a fear when it comes to the Federal Reserve. Since the Federal Reserve pretty much distributes all the money in the US, this can happen at any time. Also, the Federal Reserve kind of does print their own money for the United States government, so it'll balance out the economy. There are also good aspects of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve controls the interest rates of banks in the United States. They can increase the interest rates if the economy is in a boom, because this will push down aggregate demand in an attempt to reach full employment of resources, or they can reduce the interest rates in a recession, because that will increase aggregate demand in an attempt to reach fully employed resources in that situation. This is good for their economy, as due to this, the economy will balance out a little. This can be seen with the failure of the banks in 2008 when the economy hit a recession. What the Federal Reserve did is they lowered the interest rates, so this helped people buy more. They were scared of buying before this due to the economy failing, but when the interest rates became lower, they were incentivized to buy, and this pushed the aggregate demand up. So therefore, the Federal Reserve can be good. So this takes us back to the original question. Is the Federal Reserve bad or good? Well, the Federal Reserve has both its positives and negatives, and it's impossible to judge their worth only in one way and not look at the other way. While people might be wary of the fact that it can seemingly make money from the US from thin air, it is also important to consider the fact that because of their existence, they are able to change the value of interest rates. This will help the US economy a lot if they go into a recession or a boom, because it will help the economy go to a full employment of resources, which is what we need. Therefore, because it controls the interest rates, I feel that the Federal Reserve is better than it is badder.